The Atlantic. Spring, 1943. The sea stretched black and endless, its waves slapping softly against the steel skin of a German U-boat. Inside the dimly lit control room, a young radio operator pressed his headphones tight to his ears. For a moment, there was only static. Then came the faintest of sounds, soft, irregular ticks. The captain lifted his eyes. The crew stiffened, and the operator's face tightened with dread. The ticks grew faster, sharper, like a clock racing toward midnight. The source of those sounds was the Metox receiver, a crude wooden cross strapped to the submarine's conning tower, wired to catch the invisible pulses of Allied radar. To the untrained ear, the noise was nothing but interference. But to these men, it was the song of death. One sailor later wrote in his diary, "When the beeps doubled, you knew it was no longer a search. It was a sight. In that instant, somewhere above the waves, an enemy aircraft was not just searching the sea, it was looking directly at them." The captain shouted the only order that might save them. "Crash dive!" Full power, engines roared. Ballast tanks hissed, and the submarine nosed downward into the black water. But time had already run out. Suddenly the sky split open. A brilliant white flare cut through the night, the dreaded Lee light. In its glare, the submarine was no longer invisible. It was a silhouette, helpless against the bombs already tumbling into the sea. A young officer later recalled, "Darkness no longer saved us. Even night had betrayed us." To understand the terror of that moment, we must remember how different the ocean had been just a year before. In 1942, the night had been the U-boat's greatest shield, its cloak against the hunters of the sky. At night, submarines surfaced to breathe fresh air, charge their batteries, and prowl at speed, while Allied aircraft were blind. But in 1943, silence and darkness no longer meant safety, they meant death. This was the turning of the tide in the longest battle of the Second World War, the Battle of the Atlantic. For 3 years, the German U-boat fleet had stalked merchant convoys with near impunity, threatening to starve Britain into submission. The submariners were the predators, the wolves of the sea. But in 1943, the hunters of the deep found themselves hunted by unseen eyes that pierced the dark, by weapons born not from brute force, but from innovation. This is the story of how technology, determination, and human endurance transformed the Atlantic from a graveyard for Allied shipping into a killing ground for the U-boats. It is the story of how the ocean itself seemed to change sides, and it begins with the sound of faint clicks in the headphones, a sound that once offered hope of escape, but would soon fall silent, leaving only terror. To understand why the Battle of the Atlantic became so critical, we must step back to the ashes of the First World War. In 1919, the Treaty of Versailles left Germany's navy crippled, its proud battleships dismantled, and its submarines outlawed. Yet history has a way of repeating itself when lessons are ignored. 2 decades later, under Hitler's rule, Admiral Karl Dönitz quietly rebuilt a fleet of U-boats, convinced that undersea warfare would once again be Germany's sharpest weapon. Britain was the natural target. Unlike continental powers, the island empire survived only so long as its sea lanes remained open. Food, oil, raw materials, and weapons all had to cross the Atlantic. If those convoys failed, Britain would collapse. In 1939, a British journalist captured the fear in a single line: "The shadow that frightens us most is not the bomber above, but the submarine below." He was right. Dönitz had studied the First World War carefully. Germany had come close to starving Britain into submission before American intervention tipped the balance. Now, with new technology, improved torpedoes, and radio coordination, he believed submarines could finish what their fathers had started. His weapon of choice was not a massive battleship, but the U-boat, small, relatively cheap, and deadly efficient. In the early days of the war, Allied defenses were thin and fragile. Convoys crossing the ocean often sailed with too few escorts, sometimes none at all. Aircraft patrols could only reach the edges of the Atlantic, leaving a vast, exposed region in the middle, known as the Black Pit. Here, far from land-based bombers and destroyers, U-boat commanders stalked their prey with chilling confidence. The tactics were brutally simple. One submarine spotted a convoy and sent a contact report. Others converged, forming a wolf pack. At night, they surfaced, their diesel engines giving them speed no escort could match. They weaved between lumbering merchant ships, firing torpedoes at point-blank range. Survivors described the horror: burning seas, ships exploding into fireballs, men screaming in freezing water. Convoys were torn apart in hours. By 1940, Britain was losing hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping each month. In the spring of 1941, losses climbed to 500,000 tons, a pace that threatened to strangle the nation's lifeline. Churchill himself confessed after the war, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." And, for Germany, these were the golden days. U-boat crews called it die glückliche Zeit, the happy time. They traveled on the surface at night, smoking cigarettes on deck, joking in the conning tower, even playing gramophones while charging their batteries. They felt like lords of the ocean, invisible and invincible. Newspapers in Berlin trumpeted their victories. England trembles at the approach of our submarines. For a while, the propaganda wasn't far from truth. The Allies struggled to respond. Convoys were introduced, but escorts were too few. Destroyers were scattered thinly across hundreds of merchant ships. Early radar systems were clumsy, their long-wave beams easily lost. Pilots patrolling at night looked down at nothing but black water. By the time their instruments failed, the submarine was gone. And Britain was not the only victim. After America entered the war in late 1941, the U-boats shifted their hunt westward. Off the U.S. coast, tankers burned within sight of shore. Families walking on beaches in Virginia or Long Island could watch ships torpedoed offshore, their flames lighting the night sky. Newspapers called it the second happy time. One German captain exulted in his patrol log, "The targets are plentiful, the seas wide, and the enemy seems asleep." End of. The contrast with other theaters of war was striking. Japan, too, had submarines, but its navy clung to old doctrines, using them mainly against warships. As a result, American shipping lines in the Pacific remained far less threatened. Germany, by contrast, understood the brutal logic of strangling supply lines. And for 3 long years it seemed to work. By 1942, Admiral Dönitz commanded nearly 300 operational U-boats. He believed this force could bring Britain to its knees, cutting off supplies before American industry could fully mobilize. The statistics gave weight to his vision. Millions of tons of Allied shipping sunk, thousands of sailors dead, and convoys reduced to shattered wrecks drifting across the ocean. Yet beneath the surface of German triumph lay a hidden truth. Britain was enduring. Supplies were late, scarce, and hard-won, but they still arrived. The United States was entering the war with its vast industrial power, and in laboratories across Britain and America, scientists were working feverishly on weapons that would strip the U-boats of their greatest shield, of darkness itself. For the moment, though, in 1940 and 1941, the wolves of the sea ruled the night, and Britain trembled on the edge of collapse. The Battle of the Atlantic had become the longest, most vital struggle of the Second World War, and its outcome would decide whether Britain starved or whether it endured long enough to fight back. The ocean in the early 1940s 940 seconds was not just a battlefield, it was a hunting ground. German wolfpack tactics had matured into a terrifying science. When a lone U-boat sighted a convoy, it did not strike immediately. Instead, it shadowed the ships, sending coded signals back to headquarters. Donitz's command center in occupied France relayed the call, and other submarines converged from hundreds of miles away. Soon, a dozen U-boats or more would assemble in the convoy's path. Like wolves surrounding a herd, night was their ally. On the surface, U-boats could move faster than the lumbering merchantmen, slipping into the convoy's formation under cover of darkness. From the bridge, captains issued quiet orders as torpedoes slid into their tubes. Then came the attack, quick, brutal, merciless. Torpedoes tore into freighters, oil tankers, and troop ships, igniting towering flames that lit up the sea. Survivors flung themselves into lifeboats, their cries mingling with the hiss of burning oil. Escorts fought back desperately, but they were too few. Depth charges rumbled across the water, but the submarines were already gone, diving deep to safety before surfacing again miles away to resume the attack. To the merchant sailors, it felt like fighting ghosts. Many described the helplessness of watching ships vanish into fire without even glimpsing the enemy. The results were catastrophic. In 1941 alone, over 4 million tons of Allied shipping were lost. In 1942, the figure climbed even higher. By some estimates, Britain needed to import 1 million tons of goods per week to survive. Instead, losses were nearly outpacing new construction. On both sides of the Atlantic, rationing deepened. Civilians tightened belts, while the war effort strained to stay supplied. For the U-boat crews, these were still triumphant times. They recorded their victories with pride, chalking ship silhouettes on the walls of their quarters. Commanders who achieved high-tonnage sankings returned home as heroes, awarded the Knight's Cross by Hitler himself. German propaganda posters showed proud submariners smiling, arms folded, under slogans like "Wir fahren gegen England," "We sail against England." But the war was not confined to the cold waters of the North Atlantic. After the attack on Pearl Harbor and America's entry into the war, the hunting grounds expanded dramatically. In early 1942, U-boats surged into the Western Atlantic, exploiting America's lack of convoy defenses. The results were shocking. Tankers burned within sight of New York, their flames visible from city skyscrapers. Off Florida, German submariners could see the glow of city lights, silhouetting merchant ships against the horizon. The Germans called this campaign Operation Paukenschlag, drumbeat. For American coastal residents, it was terrifyingly visible. Families on beaches watched lifeboats wash ashore. Oil slicks drifted into harbors. Newspapers carried grim headlines: U-boat menace strikes close to home. In just 6 months of 1,942, German submarines sank more than 500 ships off the U.S. coast. For Admiral Dönitz, this was vindication. His prediction that a few hundred submarines could strangle the Allies seemed within reach. By late 1942, his fleet had grown to nearly 300 operational U-boats, each one a dagger aimed at the convoys that kept Britain alive. The numbers seemed to tell a simple story. If Germany could keep the pressure, Britain would collapse before America's industry could fully mobilize. The Allies, however, were not passive. Shipyards in the United States began producing Liberty ships at a furious pace. Some completed in as little as 6 weeks. Convoy systems expanded, but escort still lagged behind the demand. Air cover remained patchy, and the dreaded Black Pit in the mid-Atlantic continued to swallow convoys whole. For the merchant sailors, the war felt endless. Every crossing of the Atlantic meant weeks of tension, scanning the horizon for periscopes, listening for the whistle of torpedoes. Survival was often a matter of luck. One Canadian sailor later recalled, "You prayed to see land again, but in the middle of the ocean, prayers felt very small." By the end of 1942, it seemed the U-boats had achieved dominance. The tonnage of ships lost dwarfed the tonnage built. Allied leaders feared collapse. Yet beneath the surface of this crisis, quiet revolutions were already underway. Scientists, engineers, and commanders were preparing to turn the hunters into the hunted. And soon, the wolves of the sea would find that the darkness they relied upon had betrayed them. For 3 years, German U-boats had thrived in the shadows. Darkness was their shield, silence their ally. But in 1943, the very fabric of that protection unraveled. The shift did not come from brute force, or from some new battleship, but from an invisible revolution technology. The breakthrough began in British laboratories with the cavity magnetron, a device no larger than a teacup. It generated radar waves in the centimetric band shorter, sharper, and far more precise than anything that had come before. Unlike earlier long-wave radar, this new system could detect the small silhouette of a periscope or the faint shape of a submarine's conning tower on the surface. Suddenly, the ocean's vast blackness was no longer safe. Mounted on aircraft as the ASV, Moke 3 set, centimetric radar transformed the hunters of the sky. German submariners had relied on a wooden antenna called metox to pick up Allied radar beams. When the device crackled with clicks, they knew a patrol was near and could dive to safety. But metox was tuned to old long-wave signals against centimetric radar. It was deaf. Submariners began to notice something strange. Nights grew quieter, their headphones filled with only static. At first, they thought this was safety. Then, without warning, aircraft appeared out of the darkness, attacking before they could react. Silence had become deadly. The second blow came with a deceptively simple invention, the lee light. Until now, even with radar, aircraft struggled to attack in total darkness. Pilots could locate a submarine, but often lost it in the final seconds of a bombing run. The lee light solved this. A brilliant searchlight mounted under a bomber's wing. It snapped on just before the attack, flooding the sea with blinding white light. To a submarine crew, it was like being caught in a spotlight on a stage with no escape. One German officer later said, "When the light came, we knew the end had come." But technology on the surface of the water was advancing too. Allied ships adopted Huff-Duff high-frequency direction finding. This allowed escorts to home in on the very signals that coordinated wolfpack attacks. Every time a U-boat captain radioed headquarters or another submarine, his position betrayed him. What had once been Donitz's great strength, radio coordination, was turned into a fatal weakness. At the same time, the Allies closed the notorious Black Pit in the mid-Atlantic. New long-range aircraft, including the American B-24 Liberator fitted with extra fuel tanks, now reached into waters once beyond air cover. Escort carriers small, hastily converted merchant ships carrying a few dozen aircraft brought air patrols directly into the convoys. The Atlantic was no longer divided into safe and unsafe zones. The net was tightening everywhere. Technology also empowered escorts themselves. Ahead-throwing weapons like the Hedgehog mortar replaced traditional depth charges. Instead of guessing with explosive barrels dropped astern, escorts could fire patterns of contact-fused bombs directly into a submarine's path. For the first time, attacks were surgical, not scattershot. The effect on U-boat crews was devastating. Veterans who had once smoked on deck under starlight now huddled inside their steel coffins, dreading the sudden glare of a lee light or the chilling silence of their Medox receiver. Paranoia spread. Every flicker on the horizon, every blip of static on the radio, felt like the approach of death. The war at sea had become a contest of adaptation. Donitz's wolves had ruled by stealth and surprise. But by 1943, the Allies had stripped away those advantages. Invisible eyes scanned the ocean day and night. The U-boats were no longer hunters in the shadows. They were prey, exposed beneath a pitiless, watching sky. By the spring of 1943, the U-boats were still at sea in force. Dönitz, confident in his fleet, ordered ever larger wolf-pack operations, convinced that sheer numbers could overwhelm the new Allied defenses. Convoy, ONS-5, sailing from Liverpool to Halifax in April, seemed the perfect target. 42 merchant ships plowing slowly through heavy seas, guarded by only a thin screen of escorts. More than 40 U-boats converged on the convoy. For days, they shadowed from the edges of radar range, waiting for the moment to strike. On the night of May 5th, they pounced. Torpedoes lashed into the convoy, shattering tankers and freighters. Explosions echoed across the waves. Fires burned against the horizon. For a moment, it seemed the wolves had regained their mastery. But this time, the hunters struck back. Elite escorts, equipped with Huff-Duff, had pinpointed the radio chatter coordinating the attack. Aircraft from escort carriers swooped in, guided by centimetric radar. Pilots flicked on their lee lights, catching U-boats in mid-surface as they tried to reload torpedoes. Hedgehogs and depth charges rained into the sea with surgical precision. The battle raged for a week. Ships scattered across stormy seas, hunted by both torpedoes and aircraft. When it ended, the tally shocked both sides. 13 Allied merchant ships had been lost a heavy blow, but 7 U-boats were destroyed in the same battle. For the first time, Wolfpack losses outweighed their gains, and the disaster did not end there. Throughout May 1943, convoy after convoy sailed under this new shield of radar, Huff-Duff, and air cover. In that single month, Germany lost 41 U-boats, almost a quarter of its operational fleet. The scale of destruction was staggering. Young submariners, barely out of training, went to sea and never returned. Experienced commanders who had once been celebrated heroes vanished beneath the waves. The submariners themselves felt the shift. A survivor later wrote, "We were no longer predators. We were hunted animals, waiting for the trap to close." Some crews refused to surface at night, terrified of radar-guided aircraft. Others dove so deep to escape that their hulls groaned under crushing pressure. Rivet popping, steel plates bending inward. Many never surfaced again. Admiral Dönitz recognized the catastrophe. On May 24th, he made the fateful decision to withdraw his U-boats from the North Atlantic. For the first time in the war, the ocean was no longer theirs. The wolves had been driven from their hunting grounds. Historians later called it Black May, the moment when the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic turned decisively, just as Stalingrad marked the turning point on land, and Midway marked the turning point in the air war of the Pacific. Black May marked the collapse of Germany's undersea campaign. From that point onward, U-boats never regained the initiative. They remained dangerous. New models with snorkels and better torpedoes would appear, but the myth of invincibility was shattered. The hunters of the deep had been broken. The decision to withdraw the U-boats in May 1943 was more than a tactical pause. It was an admission that Germany's greatest weapon had been broken. The consequences of this shift rippled across every front of the war. First and foremost, Britain was saved. For 3 years, the island nation had lived on a knife's edge. Its food, fuel, and ammunition trickling across the Atlantic under constant threat. Now, with convoys safer than ever before, supplies flowed again in strength. By late 1943, the tonnage of shipping arriving in British ports far outstripped losses. Merchant sailors still faced danger, but the sense of desperation that had haunted the early war years began to fade. The secure Atlantic lifeline made the Allied invasion of Europe possible. Without victory at sea, there could have been no D-Day. Tanks and trucks, aircraft, fuel, and millions of men all had to cross the ocean. The Normandy landings in June 1944 were not just a triumph of planning and bravery, they were the payoff of winning the Battle of the Atlantic. One historian put it bluntly, the road to Normandy began in the mid-Atlantic. For Germany, the cost was devastating. The U-boat arm had been one of Hitler's most celebrated forces. Its commanders, national heroes. Its victories splashed across propaganda posters. But behind the triumphalism was a grim reality. Of the 40,000 men who served aboard U-boats during the war, more than 30,000 never returned, a staggering casualty rate of 75%, among the highest of any branch in any nation. Entire crews vanished without trace, their steel coffins entombed forever on the seabed. Even those who survived bore scars. Veterans described the constant pressure, the dread of the lee light, the claustrophobic dives to crushing depths. One recalled, "You could feel the boat creak like a living thing. You prayed the ocean would hold her together. You prayed you would see the sun again." For many, the psychological toll was unbearable. On a strategic level, the defeat of the U-boats highlighted the decisive power of innovation and cooperation. British scientists had pioneered centimetric radar and Huff-Duff. American industry had mass-produced escort carriers and Liberty ships in unprecedented numbers. Canadian shipyards built corvettes that escorted convoys through the most dangerous waters. The battle was won not by one nation alone, but by the combined strength of the Allies. It was also a lesson in adaptation. The Germans had dominated early by developing wolfpack tactics and effective submarines. But when the Allies innovated, Germany failed to respond quickly enough. New U-boat models with snorkels and improved batteries were developed, but too late to change the outcome. The war at sea had become a race between technology and counter-technology, and by 1943, the Allies were running faster. The long-term impact of these innovations stretched beyond the war. Radar became a foundation for modern air traffic control, weather forecasting, and even the microwave oven. The convoy system evolved into a model for protecting shipping lanes in later conflicts. From Korea to the Persian Gulf, the story of the Battle of the Atlantic was not just one of destruction. It was a preview of the modern world, where information, detection, and speed matter as much as firepower. Yet above all, the consequences were human. The victory secured Britain's survival and paved the way for Europe's liberation. But it was bought at a terrible cost. Merchant sailors, often overlooked in grand histories, bore enormous sacrifices. Tens of thousands perished in icy waters. German submariners, lionized at home, faced almost certain death each time they sailed. The Atlantic became their grave. In the end, the Battle of the Atlantic was not a story of ships and submarines alone. It was the story of endurance against fear, of cooperation across oceans, and of the relentless drive to innovate in the face of disaster. It proved that wars are not only won by armies on land or aircraft in the skies, but also by the quiet, grinding struggle to keep lifelines open across hostile seas. By May 1943, that struggle was decided. The Atlantic belonged not to the wolves, but to those who outlasted them. In the dim control rooms of German U-boats, silence became the most terrifying sound of all. Once, the Metox receiver had filled sailors' ears with warning clicks, a lifeline that told them Allied radar was searching. But in 1943, the clicks disappeared. Headphones crackled with nothing but static. For a brief, hopeful moment, crews thought it meant safety. Instead, it meant the enemy had moved beyond their reach. The silence was a trap. Above them, unseen aircraft circled with centimetric radar. At the flick of a switch, the lee light would tear open the night, flooding the sea in blinding white and exposing the submarine like a rat caught in daylight. Depth charges thundered. Hedgehogs splashed into the water, and the hunters of the deep were crushed in the darkness. They once ruled the ocean. which for years had seemed to favor the wolves, now turned against them. The vast Atlantic became a killing ground where survival was measured not in victories, but in weeks, days, sometimes hours. What had been their empire of shadows betrayed them. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest continuous struggle of the Second World War. It began as a desperate fight for survival, with Britain isolated and starving. It reached a terrible crescendo in 1942, when U-boats prowled freely from Newfoundland to the Caribbean, and it ended in 1943, when science, cooperation, and sheer human endurance tipped the balance. Its legacy is not only strategic, but deeply human. Tens of thousands of merchant sailors braved freezing seas to deliver supplies that kept nations alive. Tens of thousands of German submariners sailed into the deep, knowing most would never return. The courage, suffering, and sacrifice on both sides turned the Atlantic into one of history's greatest battlegrounds. And yet, beyond the statistics and strategy, the battle carries a deeper lesson. Wars are not decided solely by who has the biggest guns or the fastest ships. They are decided by the ability to adapt, to innovate, to endure when survival seems impossible. The Allies won not by overwhelming strength at the start, but by refusing to break, by sharing knowledge, and by turning fragile technology into decisive weapons. In the end, the wolves of the deep were defeated not by a single battle, but by a relentless tide of ingenuity and resolve. The silence in their headphones told them everything. The night no longer belonged to them. The ocean had changed sides.